Okay. All
Hello, everyone.
right. Well, hello, everybody. So thanks for joining us for this week's presentation, which we are billing as being all about taking action in response to some of the Trump administration's environmental rollbacks that are impacting us all. I am Chandra LeGue, Oregon Wild's Western Oregon Field Coordinator, coming at you from Eugene, Oregon. We have got a three-part presentation from 3 Oregon Wild staff tonight who have been on the front lines of this stuff for a long time. Following up on last week's presentation, Conservation and Restoration Coordinator Doug Heiken, sorry, I am being interrupted by something on my computer. Let me move that out of the way. So following up on last week's presentation, Conservation and Restoration Coordinator Doug Heiken is going to discuss the Trump administration's A to Z list of environmental rollbacks and attacks on the forests and wildlife of Oregon. Then we will hear from Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator Rob Klavins, who will take a deeper dive into the administration's effort to rush through a process that would remove protections for big and old trees in Eastern Oregon. And then finally, I'll jump back in with a practical training on how to effectively take action and help stop some of these attacks and stand up for your values. And we'll be sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Before we get started, I will just address a few housekeeping items. 1, if your screen freezes or you have trouble with sound, just try closing out of your browser completely, then rejoining the event with the link that was emailed to you about an hour ago. 2, we will be doing a raffle drawing for those of you attending live tonight, and we will let you know tomorrow via email if you are a lucky winner. 3, as usual, the recording of tonight's webcast will be available tomorrow on our blog, OregonWild.org. 4, if a question occurs to you at any time during the presentations this evening, please use the question bubble on your interface to type in your question, as is shown on this little opening slide here. We'll save those up for the Q&A at the end and get to as many as we can, but it's really helpful if you don't wait till the very last minute to ask your question. And finally, I hope that many of you will be able to join us next week for the 3rd webcast addressing systemic racism on public lands. Our friend Chad Brown will be back for that, and he is joined by 3 other new Mavericks, as he's billing it. The RSVP page for that event is live now on our website, and you'll also get the link when we follow up with you tomorrow. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Doug Heiken. Take it away, Doug.
All right, thanks a lot, Chandra, and nice to see everyone here tonight. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to join us during these crazy times. I'm Doug Heiken. I work in the Oregon Wild Eugene office. My job is to work on behalf of members like you to review and comment on timber sales and other federal projects and policy proposals like those that we're going to be talking about today. I'm here to give an overview of Trump's environmental rollbacks. You've seen a lot of these headlines, and I'm going to try to, put them all in one place and put a little organization to the chaos. I actually had to trim this list down quite a bit just for the sake of time because there's so many things that Trump is doing here. It's pretty depressing to put it all in one place like this, but we shouldn't sugarcoat the situation. We have a lot of work to do to address all this stuff. Not all these rollbacks I'm going to talk about are actually finalized policies. Many of them are proposals that are working their way toward final approval or they're under review in the courts. I'm going to start with personnel and appointments. Trump has installed industry lobbyists, put them in charge of virtually every natural resource agency. All the Koch brothers think tanks now have a lot of influence in our government. For example, we have William Perry Pendley, the head of the BLM. He was president of the Mountain States Legal Foundation, which is a extraction industry, think tank. In the 80s, he actually helped the Reagan administration sell off the Powder River Basin to the coal companies. He has a long history of dirty deeds. And he loves to put scientists through a political screen so he gets just the outcome he wants. Another example is Karen Bud Fallon, who is a Bundy family lawyer. She's now the Department of Interior Solicitor for Parks, Fish, and Wildlife. She's sort of the Endangered Species Act guru for the Interior Department. She's a longtime sagebrush rebel, also worked for the Mountain States Legal Foundation, lots of connections to the Koch brothers and ALEC. Scott Pruitt, former head of EPA. He's an attorney general from an energy state of Oklahoma. He's a climate denier, and he was forced out because of corruption. Now EPA is headed by Andrew Wheeler, a former coal lobbyist. As a Secretary of Interior, we have David Bernhardt, who is a lobbyist for energy, agribusiness, and giant water lobbies. Many of Trump's appointments were never even confirmed by the Senate, making them arguably unconstitutional. So the actions they take may not even be constitutionally supported. Trump is also hollowing out the regulatory agencies at other levels. He's forcing out the good guys from the agencies. He moved the BLM's national headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Colorado, expecting there would be a whole bunch of staff attrition in that process, basically erasing the institutional memory of the agency. And morale in these agencies is pretty much as low as it could ever be. Trump is also wrecking the courts. He's packing the courts at all levels with too many unqualified judges to even count. These are lifetime appointments, so it's going to create a lingering problem. Trump has basically appointed as many judges in one term as other presidents are able to appoint in 2 terms. One of the most important issues, obviously, is climate change. It's sort of the mother of all conservation issues now. Trump, of course, proudly withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord as soon as he became president. Climate action delayed is essentially climate action denied because it's so urgent that we deal with this issue. There's a new term now called predatory delay that you can look into, and Trump is mastering that strategy. He loves to say that wind turbines cause cancer, which is, of course, nonsense and difficult to deal with. Fuel efficiency is one of Trump's policies. He weakened the vehicle fleet fuel efficiency standards from about 55 miles per gallon to 40 miles per gallon, which will release about 1 billion tons more carbon dioxide and burn 80 billion more gallons of gas. He rescinded Obama's clean power plan and replaced it with affordable clean energy, also known as clean coal. Trump rescinded Obama's 2015 rules restricting CO2 emissions from coal power plants. Trump's Interior Department in particular loves the term energy dominance. He reversed the Army Corps' decision to reject the Dakota Access and Keystone pipelines, so now they're approved. He's auctioning off public lands for energy exploitation at a rapid pace. He's dismantled sage-grouse conservation plans to pave the way for more oil and gas leases in grouse habitat. Trump has officially changed the estimated cost of climate change by adjusting the social costs of carbon dioxide emissions. He's put it at $11 a ton instead of the previous $82 a ton. Basically, this tilts the playing field so that fossil fuels still look viable in spite of all the climate costs. He's expanded potential drilling in the outer continental shelf across the entire United States except Florida. This could affect 1 billion acres of public lands that are underwater. He rescinded Obama's methane waste rules for oil and gas activity on public lands, which increases a very potent greenhouse gas that leaks during fossil fuel extraction. EPA is another area where Trump has caused a lot of trouble. He's trying to deregulate more than just light bulbs and toilets and shower heads. He's trying to force EPA to limit the use of science, making it harder to develop new protection rules. He rescinded Obama's rules under the waters of the United States. He changed the definition so that it's easier to fill, remove, and pollute certain tributaries, wetlands, and small waterways that are connected to navigable waters. He's taken away states' rights to enforce the Clean Water Act under Section 401. He announced that he would stop enforcing rules during the pandemic. So now it's open season on dumping waste without consequence. Just announcing that to certain businesses just allows them to do crazy stuff that they wouldn't otherwise do. Trump disbanded a scientific panel called the Particulate Matter Review Panel, which is supposed to review toxic and air quality things, so it's easier for them to weaken the rules now. Trump's relaxed standards for how coal-fired power plants dispose of wastewater laced with pollutants like lead and arsenic. So much for clean coal. Trump repealed a stream protection rule that prevented mining waste from being dumped in streams. He's also gutted coal ash rules and mercury and air toxic rules. He delayed implementation of a chemical plant safety rule, which was supposed to help avoid and mitigate huge chemical disasters. Trump rescinded rules requiring disclosure of the chemicals used in fracking operations, which end up in people's drinking water in many cases. Trump's EPA counsel has bragged that they've won 2/3 of their lawsuits that have challenged these reforms, but don't really believe that. 2/3 is about what other administrations are able to do, but Trump tends to be pretty sloppy and rushed with their procedures, so they lose more. Earth Justice and Center for Biological Diversity say it's more like 10 or 20% of the cases that Trump is able to win. Now, moving on to public lands, he's trying to rescind national monuments in Utah, such as Bears Ears and Grand Staircase, and the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument on the East Coast, also in Oregon. We'll get to that detail a little bit later. He's opened up our national parks and wildlife refuges to hunting and trapping, affecting 149 sites, 2.3 million acres. He's amended 6 resource management plans to reduce protection for sage grouse. Trump is changing the rules for e-bikes to allow bikes, these electronic powered bikes, on hiking trails as if they were bicycles instead of motorcycles. Trump is opening up in the Arctic not only to offshore drilling, but also the coastal plain in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The first lease auction could happen before a new administration takes power, and once these leases are granted, you can't really get them back. So that would be a very sad thing if it happens. What's ironic is that some of these oil companies like ConocoPhillips are actually asking the government to use giant chillers to keep the permafrost frozen so they can continue drilling. You know, they're making climate change worse and having to mitigate it right there at their drilling sites. Trump rescinded Obama's moratorium on new coal leases on public lands. He's just recently relaxed rules for oil and gas drilling on our national forests, and he's gutted the protection for roadless areas in Alaska. He's also trying to change NEPA. This is the law that's been in place for 40 years that helps the public be involved and helps to make sure decision makers are well informed. And Trump is now imposing page limits and time limits, so there's a rush process and they can't really think it through as clearly as they should. He's eliminated the requirement for cumulative impacts analysis, which sounds like a technical mumbo jumbo, but this is critically important for how climate change is considered in federal decision making, and he just completely got rid of it. Now moving on to wildlife, there's a lot here. The Endangered Species Act, he's really doing a lot to mess with that. Trump revised the definitions to make it harder to list new species. He inserted economic considerations into the listing process. He's accelerated efforts to delist species, and he's changed the definition of habitat to make it harder to protect areas that are potential habitat or unoccupied habitat that we hope someday could be occupied. And he's changed the rules so that there's less consultation with the experts in the regulatory agencies. He's also attempted to tweak the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, adopting new interpretations that effectively exempt most of the activities that would harm birds from the prohibitions in the act. And a court recently quoted the book To Kill a Mockingbird to say that Trump's moves were illegal. However, the judge did not put back the old rules in place, and there's no indication that Trump is actually going to start prosecuting people who are violating the act, unfortunately. Trump also abandoned grizzly bear introduction in Northeast Washington. Now, closer to home, there's some interesting things. The Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, which Obama expanded. Trump said he threatened to undo that, but he actually never took action. So far, he's just letting the lawsuits that were filed by the counties and the timber industry work themselves through the judicial process. And the current status is that there are 3 separate court challenges, and they've resulted in conflicting rulings. So it's a little unclear what's going to happen there. Trump also appointed new people to FERC, which allowed them to approve the Jordan Cove LNG export project and the huge pipeline that goes from Malin to Coos Bay. This would become Oregon's largest point source emitter of greenhouse gases if it's actually built. Trump has tried to increase timber targets on both Forest Service and BLM lands through an executive order. This really has emboldened the timber beasts that are, always in the agency, but now they really get to do what they love most, which is logging our public lands. He's also trying out new things. They're using NEPA in unusual ways to try to get more timber sales done and bigger timber sales. They're using programmatic NEPA, which can capture a whole bunch of logging in one document. He also took the Whopper plan for BLM logging and really ran with it and are being very aggressive at logging those BLM lands. And now Trump is trying to eliminate 185,000 acres of critical habitat for the northern spotted owl on BLM lands in Western Oregon. This is what I talked about last week, so I won't go into much detail there, but it's especially hard hitting in Southwest Oregon, where there's a lot of critical habitat and a lot of logging. So the spotted owl is doing particularly poorly there. And under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Trump issued a new permit allowing states and tribes to kill 540 California sea lions and 176 threatened stellar sea lions over the next 5 years along the Columbia River, stretching from the ocean to McNary Dam. Trump also approved a new categorical exclusion, which would increase logging after fires, including logging of old-growth forests. And Trump proposed a rule that would eliminate the ability for the public to protest timber sales on BLM lands. And there's a science process going on in advance of the Northwest Forest Plan, and the Trump administration is basically tweaking the science and cooking the books in order to make it easier for them to increase logging. Now, a lot of these rollbacks, as we call them, are facing a lot of resistance. They're being challenged in court. Many of them have already worked their way through the lower court and are probably under appeal. The courts usually don't issue orders that say, officially the old rules are now in place permanently. They basically do something like remand it back to the agency. That's an agency ruled by Trump, and so he's able to basically fix the problem, fix the legal error the court identified, or find a different way to get to the same bad result. So the courts aren't always giving us great results. So everyone says this upcoming election is the most important ever in history, and it seems a little extra true this time, doesn't it? If Trump is reelected for another term, all bets are off. Trump's first term was a disaster, and a second term would be far, far worse. It partly depends on the fate of the Senate. If the Senate is able to, switch to the Democratic control, then they could put up some resistance through appointments and judges, maybe. If Trump is defeated, we need to undo all this stuff, but that doesn't happen overnight. It's a very difficult process, and we need to put a lot of pressure on the new administration to make sure that we not only get back what we lost, but make some actual gains in progress. So thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to Chandra and Rob.
Cool, thanks, Doug. Rob, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter in a moment there.
All right, let me get this all set up. And can you see a slide with some tree bark?
Sure can.
Perfect. And just so you know, Chandra, when you come back on, your audio is a little bit muffled, but we'll give you some time to work on that. So, all right, well, thanks, Doug. So yeah, as Chandra said, I'm Rob Klavins, the Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. I'm based in unincorporated Wallowa County, just outside the town of Enterprise and just in the shadow of the Eagle Cap Wilderness. My wife and I also own and operate a B&B and working farm in what is the homeland of the NEPA'S, better known as the Nez Perce tribe, who have lived here since time immemorial and never gave up this land. Doug did a great job talking about the breadth of attacks on the environment from the Trump administration. There's no doubt it's overwhelming, and we're not even touching on social justice, democratic institutions, or any of those not so minor issues. But our goal here is not to overwhelm you. It's really to empower you at a moment when action is needed and you can really make a difference. So we're going to try to help by drilling in deeply on one key attack here in Oregon, and then help you be an effective advocate on that issue with skills that we hope you can use and transfer to advocate for any issues that you care about. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the administration's attack on what are known as the screens, which are the most meaningful protections for big and old growth trees in Eastern Oregon. I'm going to be condensing a fair bit of information into a short period of time, so I'll just ask forgiveness for glossing some things over and encourage you to go ahead and ask questions in the question box as you have them. For those of you who participated in our Owls and Old Growth presentation a few weeks ago, some of this will be a refresher. But before I leave the slide, I want to note that anytime you see blue paint in these slides, you're seeing a tree that the Forest Service has recently marked for cutting and sending to a mill. And before we get too far, I just want to be sure to take a moment here to recognize that while we're leading this webinar, there are a number of groups working really hard on this effort to protect big and old trees in Eastern Oregon. In particular, Blue Mountain Biodiversity Project, Central Oregon Land Watch, the Juniper Chapter of the Sierra Club, and Greater Hills Canyon Council have been leading the charge. So I hope you'll consider supporting all of our organizations. We've also been working closely with the Nez Perce tribe, who are actively engaging in this as well, and whose voices certainly deserve to be heard. And that's not it. This issue primarily affects Eastern Oregon, but a number of state, regional, and even national groups have joined our core group in this fight. Despite a few outliers, the conservation community is speaking loudly and clearly against this effort. Even so, in the end, we're public interest organizations, and our power comes from the fact that we represent you. So your individual advocacy is extremely important to helping us be more effective when trying to get public agencies and public officials to do the right thing. And as we get into the meat of this, I just want to start out by saying something that seems really simple and really obvious, which is that big trees are important. Whether they're alive or dead or dying, or if they're standing, or if they've fallen onto the ground or into a stream, whether they're young or they're old, big trees provide habitat for all sorts of species. Where I live here in northeastern Oregon in the northern Blue Mountains, big trees are the limiting factor for literally dozens of species. The list includes bats, owls, bears, invertebrates, marten, woodpeckers, fungi, fish, raptors, the list goes on and on. I think a little bit of history is in order, and being from the Midwest, I like to start with Paul Bunyan. After liquidating forests in the East and Midwest, the timber industry set up shop in the Pacific Northwest and cut down our forests with an eye towards the biggest trees. Eastern Oregon was no exception, so most of our old growth forests are long gone. And the liquidation of our forests and the values they provided led to what were the infamous timber wars. In the western part of Oregon and Washington, the spotted owl was the poster child for the battle over that critical piece of wildlife habitat, which is old growth. And the truce in those forests came in the form of the Northwest Forest Plan that Doug touched on earlier. In Eastern Oregon and Washington, we got something far less celebrated, but it's no less important. The shorthand for those protections is the screens. The screens were put into place as a placeholder until the Forest Service considered and implemented a whole suite of recommendations from scientists and included things like strict limits on cutting big and old trees, restrictions on road building, logging reform, changes to livestock grazing and riparian areas, and on and on and on. The sad thing is the Forest Service never fulfilled that promise, so the screens have remained. And a key part of the screens is what's known as the 21-inch rule. Notably, scientists recommended a 20-inch rule, but what it means is that the Forest Service adopted a prohibition of logging trees over 21 inches in diameter. And that's the rule that we're talking about today. In addition to protecting big and old trees, the 21-inch screens did a lot of other good things. With old growth logging and the biggest remaining trees no longer on the chopping block, the screens and other important sideboards that Doug spoke about created the conditions for collaboration and other forms of negotiating the terms of the truce at the end of the timber wars. The screens also help protect wildlife habitat, they sequester carbon, they maintain soils, they help provide clean, cold water, and lots more. Before I leave the slide, I want to note I picked these couple photos on purpose. Trees like the big and sort of moss-covered grand fir that you see in these photos thrive in Eastern Oregon and Washington. You may get the impression that it's all just dry pine and desert out in Eastern Oregon. That is not the case. Large grand fir and other ones are the ones that are most at risk of being turned into 2x4s if the Forest Service doesn't adjust course. As you can imagine, industry and their allies never liked any restrictions on logging. The cycle of boom and bust that the timber industry left in its wake across America was already close to hitting Eastern Oregon when the screens were put into place. The industry's unsustainable practices were already leading to an end to the logging boom. Their mechanization of mills and their practice of sending logs also inevitably leading to the bust in timber jobs. And notably, while the rule change that the Forest Service is considering may increase profits for industry executives in places like Lake Oswego or Idaho, this rule change will do next to nothing to address jobs in rural communities. But environmental protections make a great straw man for industry executives and politicians so that they can explain away every problem and avoid accountability. And so another driving force here is that some people in the Forest Service simply want to have as much discretion as they can have. It's an understandable impulse and it can sound appealing, but more often than not, that discretion and ambiguity leads to more conflict and controversy rather than the other way around. Ambiguity and discretion also allows the agency to be subject to political pressure, to bend to ever-changing political winds and be abused by bad actors. And of course, there's no faster way to meeting arbitrary timber targets than cutting big trees. And it's worth noting that despite the protections on public lands, the industry never stopped logging big and old trees on their own private lands. Where I live in northeastern Oregon, that process has really sped up in recent years, and supply on industrial timberland is rapidly running out. So the industry has very little choice but to turn their hungry mills back towards our public lands. And even on public lands, despite the screens, the Forest Service pretty regularly proposed logging of big and old trees in specific projects. And in some very, very specific cases, we even agreed that dropping some larger trees might make ecological sense. Just to be clear with this slide, the photo on the left is something we would strongly oppose and did, but cutting the tree in the foreground on the photo on the right is something we might have been able to support. But as ever, give an inch, they take 21 miles. And these really, really contextual agreements were spun to say, conservationists say that the screens are arbitrary. Even Oregon Wild admits we need to loosen the rules, and it's just really a violation of public trust. Another half-truth that, industry and now the agency loves to tell is the idea that the screens were meant to be temporary. They skipped the inconvenient but critically important part, which is that they were meant to be temporary placeholders until the Forest Service implemented more holistic protections. That never happened, and it's not happening now. So that gets us to today. At the end of the Trump administration's first, and we'll see if it's the last term, they found a willing ally. Retiring Republican Congressman Greg Walden would love his legacy to be eliminating those pesky old protections for his friends in industry. And all across the country, the administration is undermining environmental protections as fast as they can identify them. There were a bunch in Doug's list I'd never even heard of before. But here in Oregon, under pressure from local politicians, industry, and others, they've targeted the screens. And the political pressure on the Forest Service is just undeniable. Trump's appointee as Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, has issued a series of memos telling his staff to get the cut out and to make the right people happy. He's promised to conduct regular check-ins to be sure that they're doing what he's told them to do, and recently went as far as to post job openings for those folks. So the message to the agency is incredibly clear. And so it's in that context that the Trump administration and the Forest Service are rushing through what they call an amendment to the screens. And as with nearly every effort that we've seen to reduce restrictions on logging since the trademark of Smokey Bear, it's largely been couched in some form of fire hysteria or another. With nearly all the big old trees gone, now they want to cut the big young trees. There's always an excuse. It's usually fire, and the solution almost invariably involves more logging. The argument that they're using here is fundamentally Orwellian, that to save big and old trees, we have to log them. And to justify the process, the Forest Service created this scientific report that's based on cherry-picked science and ignores the objections of independent scientists. Scientists who have rightly asserted that in the absence of the return of old growth, which by definition takes more than 25 years to come back, big trees are irreplaceable. As an example of just how seriously the agency is, or I should say isn't, taking their responsibility, and their scientific background doesn't even consider things like a carbon analysis that we know would get in the way of their desired outcome of allowing the logging of big trees, which will undeniably contribute to the worsening of climate change. So the Forest Service has suggested a number of goals, some of them very laudable, like changing the composition and density of our forest, or protecting communities from fire. But those goals can be achieved by thinning smaller trees and with other socially acceptable and ecologically based means. The problem is not that we have too many big trees, it's fire suppression, it's past logging, overgrazing, irresponsible development and climate change, but addressing those fundamental causes of the problem is not what the industry or this administration want. So I think the agency hoped that we'd simply go along, or at least we'd be overwhelmed, and with so much happening, the broad public just simply wouldn't notice about this thing happening in Eastern Oregon. But that didn't happen. Despite some attempted greenwashing and token support from a small number of people willing to go along, the conservation community is speaking up loudly and against this process. Sorry, skipped ahead there. 27 groups recently raised their objections. In a letter, I helped organize the effort, and I can say that the only limitation to the number of groups that joined the effort was the amount of time we had to reach out. And the letter was summarily ignored by the agency. We have not heard a substantive response back. Concerns have also been brought up by the scientists that I mentioned before, tribes, bird groups, wildlife groups, public health organizations, credible environmental law firms, and more. But the Forest Service rollout has just been as stubborn as ever. Rather than slow down or adjust course in any meaningful way, the agency skipped a scoping process, which is a normal and important part of any credible public review or engagement process. In addition to a rushed and biased scientific assessment that marginalized independent scientists that I mentioned earlier, they're doing all of this against their own guidance not to do such things during a pandemic. In a leaked memo, the Forest Service said that if a review like this is not based on an immediate economic need, they shouldn't do it. But the leaders of the project have publicly acknowledged that if this is about economics, it won't have public support or be durable, and they're absolutely right. So the Forest Service is trying to have it both ways by saying it's not about economics, but we have to push on despite our internal guidance against doing so. So as the Forest Service's own leaked memo shows, they know it's also a serious social justice issue, but their public response has been silence and some rote box-checking exercise to demonstrate that they're doing something. And in private discussions, leadership was just disdainful and utterly dismissive of the notion that the pandemic was affecting people's ability to engage. And that doesn't take into account even newer crises that are growing and rightly occupying our time, our efforts and energy as individuals and organizations across the spectrum. Unfortunately, the administration has found a few complicit voices that may have good intentions based on limited experience, but they've been enabling this effort, undermining the conservation community and doing tremendous damage. So with such consequential decision affecting over 9 million acres taking place during ongoing national crises and an election, you think the agency would take their time. Instead, despite token efforts, the agency has skipped entire steps of normal public engagement. They've delegated the official decision down to a local forest supervisor. They chose not to do a robust environmental impact statement. And despite requests from all of the groups we talked about, from Senators Wyden and Merkley, they've limited the time that the public can comment to the absolute minimum required by law, which gets us to today. Earlier this month, we finally saw the administration's proposal. And after all of the platitudes and promises from the agency and supporters of the scheme, we were eagerly prepared to eat crow. That's what we were hoping for. Sadly, it was not the case. In fact, the proposal was worse than most of us had feared. The agency eliminated all protections for major cohorts of big and old trees, and where any protections remain, they've been changed from what were enforceable rules and standards to guidelines that essentially amount to discretionary suggestions that we've seen abused time and time and time again. There are some promises of adaptive management, but with little to nothing to back it up. So by the time the agency could even adjust course, the damage will have already been done, and it would take generations for our forests to recover. In the meantime, the agency is already planning timber sales with the assumption that this is a done deal, and we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So what to do? Last time I gave a version of this presentation, I suggested that folks contact Senators Wyden and Merkley and ask them to weigh in. And here's what I have to say. Thank you to everybody listening. Hundreds of you did exactly that. And to their great credit, they listened. Our senators wrote a letter to the administration and asked them to slow things down. We expect the agency is going to make some half-measure movement in that direction, but it won't change the substance of the proposal. It won't change the political context. And it doesn't mean that the agency isn't still cutting corners or breaking the law. And again, most importantly, it doesn't change the substance of the proposal. And regardless, the comment period, though, is still open, and they need to hear overwhelmingly from the public that they serve on this issue. You are the public. They are a public agency. So I'm going to hand things over to Chandra, who's going to tell you how you can weigh in. But before I do that, for those of you who want extra credit, once you've submitted your comment, please consider taking a moment and calling your senators and thanking them for weighing in. We often ask them for their help. And given the stubbornness of Trump's agency, we're likely going to need their help again. So it's not just nice, but it's also important to thank them for doing the right thing. And with that, Chandra, I'll turn it over back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Okay. All right. Rob, can you tell me if you're seeing my screen?
I can, and you sound very clear.
Okay, I had taken off my dorky looking headset before, so. Okay, well, thank you so much for that awesome overview, and to Doug as well. So I'm going to focus on sort of how we can be most effective at fighting back against both, rollbacks that we're seeing from the Trump administration, as well as other issues that you all might care about, and then also specifically on this Eastern Oregon old growth proposal. And this is adapted from a presentation I did for our Wild Ones program a year or two ago, that was looking at different levels of government and how to make a difference. So you'll be seeing a little bit of that, but anyway, there's a lot to cover. I guess I want to start out by saying that this can come across as being overwhelming, as Rob also acknowledged, and kind of full of doom and gloom, and maybe feel a little hopeless. But I just really want to reiterate how important it is for all of your voices to be raised and to join with ours, all of those other organizations that that Rob has been talking to around the side screens. It's essential to make any kind of difference in our world that we all raise our voices together. So you can make a difference. Thank you for being here, and hopefully we can stop some of this stuff together. And let's see, I think I'll go ahead and move forward. So here's just some examples of how weighing in really matters. Doug talked a little bit about NEPA, that's the National Environmental Policy Act, which Trump's and previous Congresses have worked to roll back. But we use it a lot. In fact, Doug comments on behalf of Oregon Wild and all of our supporters on roughly 200 different projects every year that are going through the NEPA process, where the public gets to weigh in on what's being proposed by federal agencies when there's going to be impacts on the ground. So through that process and all those comments, we do get some changes that are made in some projects. It's kind of hard to quantify, but certainly we see changes between like the scoping notice and the final decision in many cases, because we're weighing in and bringing science to the table, et cetera. Often we do have to move beyond just comments and submit objections or protests or appeal decisions that are made by federal agencies through NEPA. Which results in more positive changes often. And sometimes we do have to resort to litigation, but that's really where your voice becomes even more important. Raising your voice helps us build the record of public support or opposition for what's being proposed. So for example, when we ask our supporters for to raise their voice through alerts that we put out, it's really helping us show that hundreds or thousands of people care about this, when we can then talk about with the media or with our elected officials or bring it to the courtroom. Our members and their actions help give us legal standing in court when it's necessary, which has become more and more important under the Trump administration. And then it also builds public pressure when we want to bring attention to an issue, with a reporter, for example. So the response is often overwhelming from all of you. So when we issued alerts about attacks on NEPA just in the last year, we've generated over 1,000 comments, in support of our position. Doug mentioned the rollback or the proposed change to reclassify electric bikes to be able to use them on non-motorized trail. Almost 1,000 people commented on that when we asked you to back in May. You know, back in 2019, we asked folks to weigh in on some changes to the Endangered Species Act, and again, got almost 1,000 comments. So it's really, really important and vital for you to keep doing that. I have down here old growth tree protection. How many comments are we going to get? I know that through our alert from a week or two ago, we already have over 1,000 comments. So let's keep it going, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, so I'm going to transition to sort of some of the how to be most effective. And one of those things is really just knowing where to direct your efforts. And so you need to understand who has the power over the issue that you're concerned about, and you need to know how to influence those with the decision-making authority. And so this is a quick rundown that I probably should keep an eye on the time. Quick rundown of some of those things, but understand that it's maybe not super straightforward, as straightforward as you might think. So, for example, if you're trying to influence, laws and regulations, certainly targeting your legislators makes sense. You can do that by going to town hall meetings, or signing a petition, or calling them on the phone, sending them a letter. But there's multitudes of ways to influence them. But then your legislators, in turn, influence a lot more than just the laws and regulations that they might set, in Congress or in the State House. So here's some more examples of that. So at the various different levels of government, you have, elected officials, like, for example, with county government, your board of commissioners. They'd have direct jurisdiction over things like county laws and policies, but they also influence our state and federal government by weighing in as a board, for example, on a particular issue. All too often in Oregon, it's, hey, we want to see more logging. And that is influential, unfortunately. Even though they don't have direct jurisdiction over it, it's sending a message up the chain of command. So it's important to recognize that, that there's folks to influence who may not be have direct jurisdiction, but can have influence in other complicated ways. At the same time, at the state government, sure, at the governor's office, the governor signs legislation, they set direction for the state agencies, but they also can influence federal legislation, even though that's outside their jurisdiction. When we're looking at the federal government, of course, we've got, our elected officials, our Congress people, our senators that are making laws. But in the same way, they might direct, an issue that's down a couple levels of government, or, just weighing in the court of public opinion can be really powerful when they do something like that. Federal courts, of course, are very influential, and we don't have as many angles in influencing those necessarily. However, the administration that is appointing folks to federal courts can be really influential. And then with the various federal agencies, if it's a rule change, for example, like for the ESA or for NEPA, those are the folks that we need to be targeting. Those are the people making the decisions. However, it's just important to recognize that there might be influence from the administration higher up, or there might be influence from lobbyists. So it's maybe not quite so straightforward sometimes. Local agency offices, or Forest Service offices, or BLM offices, are really what drive the NEPA process forward. And so knowing the different levels of NEPA analysis and when to weigh in can be really important for being the most effective. It's always great to send a letter to, your local ranger district to tell them that you're unhappy with, a logging project that you happen to drive by. But if it's not, part of an open comment period, they might not they may say there's nothing they can do about it. So understanding that there are these open periods for weighing in under NEPA. So Rob talked about, with the East Side Screens rulemaking, that the Forest Service skipped scoping comments, which is allowable in some cases. In this case, I don't think it's been a great idea. But often there are scoping comments. So it's the very early stages of project development when the public gets a chance to weigh in. Then there's later comment periods, like the one we're currently in now, that weighs in on an environmental assessment under NEPA, when the public again has the right to weigh in. And then sort of getting closer to a decision, there are sort of a little bit more advanced objections or appeals that usually Oregon Wild does on behalf of our supporters, but citizens certainly have the right to do, that can influence the final decision that gets made. In the end, once a decision is made by the agency at whatever level is appropriate, you either have to live with it or you have to litigate and win. And so weighing in early is really important to not getting to the point where you have to live with a decision that nobody's happy with. I just want to note here that outside of the NEPA process, there's a couple of other opportunities for the public to get involved, sometimes early and sometimes with a lot of influence. And that can be through collaboration, which there are several sort of official forest collaboratives that operate under national forests that the public can be engaged in. And then often the Forest Service or BLM host public meetings or field trips where it's great to get a lot of exposure to a specific area, ask questions of the people who are going to be making the decisions or the specialists who are writing the documentation and doing the analysis. So those are other really great ways for the public to get involved. Okay, I'm actually going to skip this next slide because it's too much. So I understand that sometimes even if we are targeting exactly the right people and influencers, we still lose. We still don't get what we want. And so I just want to draw attention to a couple of other ways of being effective in creating change. And some of those are, use your imagination. But some standard ones, of course, are to just help spread the word. The more people that you can share information with, the more people you can organize with, the louder a voice is going to be. So that can look like a rally or just talking to your friends. Bringing issues to the court of public opinion. This is, talking to reporters or writing letters to the editor or, various other ways. Again, use your imagination. If the public hears about an issue that they maybe weren't familiar with, it's going to raise more questions and get more attention. Don't be afraid to get elected officials involved in issues, even if it doesn't seem like it's in direct line with what they're, with where they can make a difference. Congressman DeFazio, my congressman, has weighed in on local timber sales from time to time because they're places that he knew and he cared about. And it's not that he can stop, the federal agency from moving forward, but it can give them pause if he raises concerns. And so, give your local offices a call about any issue that you think they might be able to help with. And if none of that works, honestly, and for many of the things that Doug talked about, that are being rolled back from the top down from the administration, these appointees that are just wreaking havoc on our environmental laws, we need regime change. And that's where voting becomes really important. So I know that both Rob and Doug touched on that already, but that's one of the most important things we can do. Okay, so transitioning to the issue at hand real quick here. When we're talking about writing comments on this rulemaking to take away these protections for old growth trees in Eastern Oregon, here's some just general tips for writing comments to the Forest Service. Again, you want to make sure you're directing it to the right person at the right address, and so we can help you with that. We have an alert on our website that does that for you. If you want to put in your information, we've already got it plugged in that it's going to the right place. There's also a web page through the Forest Service where you can go, and we'll make sure to get you all of these links. That is specifically designed for the public to weigh in, so you know it's going to the right place. You want to be clear on what you're addressing and what you're asking for. You want to address specific elements of the proposal if you can, if you have the time to do that sort of background research. Raise specific issues as early in the process as possible. Like I said, you know, if we get to the point of the Forest Service making a decision, it's a lot harder to get specific changes. It's okay to support things in any proposal that you actually like, and maybe counterbalance it with things that you are not supportive of. And perhaps most importantly, coming from, you know, the general public who cares about public lands, is say how you're impacted by a certain proposal. I'm actually going to move to the next slide. You can see here's me next to a beautiful big ponderosa pine tree that certainly shouldn't be cut, and probably wouldn't be under this amendment. But you know, I love being out with these beautiful big trees and hiking, and just the experience that I have out there, and watching wildlife in the snags, woodpeckers, etc. And you know, being able to add a little bit of personal touch is great. Okay. And so when we're weighing in on this particular proposal, here's some just general talking points, which again, Oregon Wild has, if you want to sign our letter or if you want to augment it in any way. So this rule isn't really necessary. They don't need to be moving it through super fast. It's controversial, so it's another reason to slow down and really consider things. It's going to have big impacts, and they should do a more robust analysis. And they should consider alternatives that actually strengthen large tree protections instead of just weakening them, which is not an alternative that they've considered in this proposal. So there's a few key talking points there. Okay, with that, since we're getting close to our time, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring Rob and Doug back. Awesome. And see what sort of questions we have. Okay, I'm going to kind of go up towards the top because I saw a couple of fairly straightforward ones. One is, do the screens apply to the west side forest? Or maybe it could be a little bit more specific as to what the proposed rule is applied to as far as Oregon. It's Rob, you want to take that?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and then Doug can weigh in if I get some stuff wrong. But the east side screens the screens apply to the trees, or to the national forests east of the Cascades that are not covered by the Northwest Forest Plan. That also includes Washington. What's notable and sort of weird, and kind of again points to the politicization and just arbitrariness of what they're doing, the amendment, the change that they're making to the screens only applies to Eastern Oregon, and there's a little piece of the Umatilla National Forest that goes up into Washington. They're not addressing the national forests up in Washington, and so the idea that somehow the science applies here and not there doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But that said, you know, even though that's smaller than it could be, we're talking about 6 national forests, over 9 million acres of forests in Eastern Oregon. And that's why one of those comments that we suggest is an important one is that the Forest Service is trying to skip a lot of process and analysis by saying it's very narrow in scope. We're just talking about logging big and old trees, ignoring the fact that we're talking about 9 million acres, 6 national forests that, as I showed in those slides, aren't just dry ponderosa pine like you might see in Bend. They're also forests that if I blindfolded you and put you in them, you'd think you were in the Coast Range. There's big Doug fir dripping with moss. These are really variable landscapes, and so this is a very consequential rule.
And just to put names on it so people, might have camped there, we're talking about the Deschutes, the Fremont Wainema, the Ochoco, the Malheur, the Wallowa Whitman, and the Umatilla. Those are the national forests. And there's little parts of the Wainema and parts of the Deschutes that are not included because they're part of the Northwest Forest Plan, covered by the spotted owl, but everything else.
Awesome.
And
Thanks
I
for
just
that
did the math.
clarification.
That's really quickly. I did the math just on my phone here. That's 14,843 square miles.
Yeah, I guess we never really put up a map of this, but you can. It's more than half of Oregon for sure. Okay, really easy questions that I'll cover now in case folks have to jump off, but there's a number of questions asking about whether these presentations will be available, whether the tips, whether Doug's list of rollbacks, et cetera, will be available. And this whole thing is recorded, so you can watch it that way. And there's also a great blog post that Rob has on our website. If you search Forever 21 on our website, you'll find this blog post that has a lot of great background information specifically about this proposal. And we can send as a reference, there have been some great compilations of these Trump environmental rollbacks published in case Doug doesn't want to run through, put his up on our blog, but we'll definitely make sure that people have that. Okay. One question it says, there are so many petitions. How effective are they really, and how are they used? And I'll try to cover that real quick. It's true. It depends on who's putting out a petition and what they're asking you to do. Oregon Wild doesn't do a lot of petitions simply because we usually ask you to weigh in directly with, a decision maker on a specific issue. Sometimes we do collect names on a petition because it can be just easier to do that and more impactful depending on who we're directing it to. But they really are used to advocate for the issue at hand, or that we're spelling out. It's not just to gather names, if that's a concern. How effective are they? Again, I think it really depends on who the target is and for what purpose. So I feel like elected officials often are pretty responsive to seeing a big stack of names. If it's 1,000 people signed on to the same comment letter for the East Side Screens, it's maybe less effective, and having a lot more individuals weigh in with more specifics is probably going to be more effective. So, sorry, Rob, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was interrupting. I would say, they're probably as effective as the organization that is encouraging you to sign it is, because, how strategic are they being about what they're doing and asking you to do. And, the reality too is we have moved into an age where there are so many of these things that also the absence of comment can really be noticed as well. And so, I certainly know, if we didn't get thousands of or hundreds and maybe thousands of comments on this, the agency would be allowed to say, see, nobody cares about it. So I think it's still really important. And Chandra's point is good. Just clicking the action, that's good. Taking it a step further and adding your own personal comments, that's better. Doing that and writing a letter personally, you can kind of escalate what you do and the impact that has.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can kind of rank the things. A petition, it was, kind of on the low end. A form letter would be a step up. A personalized letter would be a step up from that. And then you can, get into lots of other more in-depth things, like calling a congressperson or calling the decision maker, having a meeting with a person, letters to the editor, things like that.
Yep. Okay, this seems like an important one, guys. For Rob and Doug, what will it take to stop this proposal? What are the strongest arguments for stopping this proposal at this stage as opposed to ending up in court?
Well, that's a good one right there. Let's not have this end up in court. And I think that, as Doug pointed out right before this call, in the first bullet point there is, this change is not necessary. We don't have too many big trees on the landscape. The goals that the Forest Service says that they want to accomplish, they can accomplish by doing the things that they say that they're doing whenever they promote their logging projects: thinning smaller trees, focusing on places near homes and infrastructure. They have the flexibility to address these concerns. to the extent that we might want to consider making some changes, we ought to be doing it in a deliberate manner, in a manner that has the support of the broad public and all the different stakeholders, that isn't just steamrolling the majority of the public, the conservation community, independent scientists, and all of those different interests. And again, just remembering that every time we hear industry and now the agency say this was meant to be temporary, it was meant to be temporary until we had these more holistic protections. So if we're going to have a discussion about these holistic protections that ensure that we are protecting all of the values in our public lands, then we could have that discussion. All we're talking about right now is eliminating and reducing protections for big and old trees. So I think that's the quickest answer. I mean, I could go on for hours. I won't. And then I think, how do we stop it? This is the only real avenue we have right now. So far, the Forest Service hasn't indicated that they're really all that interested in listening to anybody that gives them some different perspective. And we know that that's largely because of the political pressure that they're under. And so we need to change that paradigm. And so we're going to need to continue to talk to Senators Wyden and Merkley and get them to stay engaged in this process as the Forest Service continues to move forward. You all better vote so that we make sure that we have an administration. It's clear that they're trying to get this done before Inauguration Day. But it's one of the things that if we have a new administration, maybe they can roll it. They can roll back the rollback. So voting is really important. And then finally, the reason we're asking you to do this right now is to demonstrate how much the public really cares about this and the flaws in the arguments that the agency has, and empower us, Oregon Wild, Greater Hells Canyon, Central Oregon Land Watch, Blue Mountain Biodiversity Project, Sierra Club, and others. It empowers us to be able to make those arguments as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, it's unlikely that an individual member of the public is going to put something in a letter that changes the mind of the Forest Service and they're going to stop doing it. They're going to reach a decision, but demonstrating public opposition to this is essential to those other mechanisms that are going to stop this, whether it's, another administration reversing course, after a rush process, or even litigation. Showing strong public opposition actually, is something that the judges are kind of paying attention to. So we need everyone pulling together on this thing.
And a quick bite at the apple, I would also note, the agency, we know what pressure they're under. We know what they're determined to do. It doesn't mean that they have to, and they could change it out of the goodness of their heart and just wanting to do the right thing. And to that end, the Forest Service and the leadership has been really clear that they're really sensitive to the potential controversial nature of this, and how important it is that it be durable. And it's not going to be durable if the public doesn't support it and the public isn't supporting it. And so it's actually addressing one of their fundamental things, which is we want to have public trust and public support, and demonstrating that this isn't the way that they can get it. There are other ways to do it that we would happily support and work in good faith with them, as with the broader public. So there's also just the fundamental thing. They asked for it. We got to give it to them.
That's a great note to end on. There were a few other sort of political questions that came in, which I think we more or less touched on. But yeah, as Doug said, we're facing having to a slow process of rolling back these rollbacks. But at the same time, even if if Biden happens to win the election, and we don't have a second term of Trump, there's a lot of work to do, and this is one of the processes that sort of rises. Well, it will continue regardless of who's president, and so weighing in now is absolutely vital, as Rob just said. So, all right, we're going to stop there. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Doug. Thank you all of you who are out there paying attention. We'll send a follow-up tomorrow, so you get some of the links for commenting, and you can watch again or share with your friends. So until next week, we will talk to you later.
Thanks for everybody's help. Take care.